We will be in 1 Timothy chapter 3. If you want to follow along in our Bible class tonight. Derek's got me a light up here so I can see what I'm looking at a little bit better. Well, last week I enjoyed the service of the Thanksgiving service and the lessons that were brought last week and the fellowship we had. Tonight's fellowship's a little bit better because we got to do it a little bit longer and have food with it. Appreciate all that. And Tanya's made one of my favorite dishes, and I appreciate that. So now let's get something spiritually nutritious in us. We've been studying the dwelling place of God. We want to understand the dwelling place of God. We want to appreciate the dwelling place of God. And we want to be the dwelling place of God as He has intended it. Our Bible history tells us the story of mankind's quest to be in the presence of God Almighty. And it also documents our failure, mankind's failure time after time to attain a place with God on our own terms. And to this end, the psalmist expressed the desire of this quest. David wrote, in Psalm 27 and verse 4, "One thing I have desired of the Lord, that I will seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in His temple." This is what David's desire was. And I think he sums up the desire of most who sincerely seek God. And to David's delight, he came to know that God invites us into His house. He continued in verse 7, "Hear, O Lord, when I cry with my voice. Have mercy also upon me and answer me. And when you said, 'Seek my face,' my heart said to you, 'Your face, Lord, I will seek.'" There's not only a willingness to be near to God, there's an invitation that God has for us to be near to Him. And there is also a dread of being outside of His presence. And so David continued, "Do not hide your face from me. Do not turn your servant away in anger. You have been my help. Do not leave me nor forsake me, O God, my salvation. And when my father and mother forsake me, then the Lord will take care of me." David had come to know that the house of God is stronger, longer lasting, more reliable, and safer than back home, even with his earthly family. So our Bible history tells us the story of mankind's quest to be in the presence of Almighty God and their failure time after time to attain a place with God on our own terms. But it also tells the story of God's quest to bring mankind into His presence. This is His desire too, but His presence demands holiness. We're reminded that God is holy. We can become holy, but He cannot become unholy. So in the Old Testament, He gave instructions on how to approach Him in holiness. He defined what is holy and what is not holy, what is clean and what is unclean, what is lawful and what is unlawful, what is acceptable worship and what is false worship. If they lived holy and they could remain, then they could remain with Him and He with them. If they rejected His ways, it was a rejection of Him, a rejection of God. And when they did, He left them and He would leave His temple. You see, you can enter the house of God. You cannot enter the house of God and make your own rules. There's a cliche that says, "My house, my rules." And that's kind of been an unwritten rule for most homes. It's our dominion. Our name is on that mortgage, so it's our house and our rules. And today, God's name is still on His house, and the payment is the blood of His Son. And so, it's His house. We do what He wants, the way that He wants it. So in His house, which is the church, it's imperative to know what His dominion demands. To know what that looks like and what that sounds like, first Paul spent a few years with the Christians in Ephesus, then he followed it up with a couple of letters. One was directly to them, and then the other one to their preacher, whose name is Timothy. And so he wrote to Timothy and said, "I write so that you may know how you ought to conduct yourself in the house of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and the ground of truth. And so as we began this, we began in chapter 1 where we read that there should be no other doctrine than what the apostles have given. In chapter 2 we read about the doctrine of prayer and the positions of men and women in this house of God, in the church. And then in chapter 3 we read about the positions of elders and deacons, and that's where we're at tonight. In the previous chapter he made a distinction between men and women, and now in this chapter he makes a distinction simply between men. And it's based on their character, their marriage and family status, their standing in the community, and their maturity as a disciple. So in the last lesson, we looked at several passages of the Old Testament. From Moses when he acquired 70 elders to help bear the load in Numbers 11. Then we looked at Ezekiel chapter 34 with the condemnations of the elders of Israel who were more like wolves rather than shepherds. Maybe you remember those passages. We also noted that chapter 34 of Ezekiel, that there was a Davidic promise of a shepherd to come, one that was the good shepherd. And so then we looked in the New Testament in John chapter 10 where Jesus announces that he is the good shepherd. We looked in 1 Peter chapter 5 where Peter tells the elders of the church to follow the pattern of Jesus, who is the chief shepherd, and to shepherd the flock of God which was among them. We know from our study in Acts chapter 20 that at some point the church at Ephesus had elders, but they were warned that there were wolves among them. So now Paul gives the qualifications for those who will serve in this capacity. And we got as far as verse 1. And in verse 1 we read that this is the faithful saying, if a man desires the position of a bishop, he desires a good work. And so there are a couple things that stand out. First, a man. And we talked about how this means man, male, not mankind. This is man. And then he also underscores that fact. And that this is a work. This is a work. And we looked at the Greek word ergon, which is translated as work. In the English word is ergonomics, that comes from this Greek word, which deals with workplace safety and efficiency. So in this first verse we established that what was about to be described distinguishes qualities of one man from another, and that this is more than a title that's synonymous with the word bishop, overseer, elder, shepherd, pastor, all these other things. It is, in fact, a work. As with any job, there are qualifications. In the next 6 verses, we can read. They kind of read like a part of a job advertisement that lists those qualifications. And so we'll get to those in just a minute. Let me pause and ask if there's any other comments before we go further into verses 2 through 7. Any thoughts, comments? Nick?
The ESV, the version I read from, it calls that a noble task. The task, I think, kind of weakens it a little bit because it is a work. And it kind of reminds me of like with any job, you're not entitled to get a job that you interview for. You have to be qualified for it. And the same thing for being an elder or bishop or whatever you choose to call it. You need to meet these qualifications that he's going to get into.
Right. Good point. I like that too. Any other thoughts? All right, well, CJ?
What the LSP says, it is virtually saying any man aspires. What did you say?
Verse 1, this is a faithful saying, if a man desires.
So I really like the idea of there's the desire aspect, but also it takes effort to get there. You're also aspiring to a position. That's, I think, self-evident in these qualifications that follow.
Yeah, good point. So one version says desire, another aspire, and it kind of gives you the idea that there's an intention towards getting to that place, right? Good. All right, as we go through here, we're going to read the qualifications of an elder. But as we go through here, I want you to think, are there any of these things that all of us should not aspire to be? Right? So we're going to read through this. Keep that in mind. Nick, you have a really good reading voice. Would you read from the back, verses 1 through 7?
I had it ready, so I knew you would ask me. The saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own household well, with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. Moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders, so that he may not fall into disgrace, into a snare of the devil.
All right, thank you. All right, so we'll go back in verse 2. A bishop must be blameless. I'm reading from the New King James Version. Other versions read above reproach, meaning above moral disappointments. The same Greek word is used in chapter 6 and verse 14 and translated there by some versions as unrebukable. While blameless in our modern vocabulary may mean perfect or without sin, we know that nobody is actually perfect in that sense. Here, I think, above reproach or above moral disappointment and unrebukable helps us to understand what he's talking about when we read that a bishop must be blameless. This is a person, this person is one that is without accusation. When things go wrong, he's not the one that everybody blames because he's not the one to blame. In other words, nobody has a solid reason to rebuke this person. And then it continues, the husband of one wife. And so this verse confirms again that this is a man. Adam failed to shepherd his wife and instead became a follower. From his garden to his house, God has called on men to rise up and lead. And I can say that over the years I have been disappointed in men who are willing to rise up and lead. And I can say over the years I have been amazed at the good men who have risen up and led. And the men of God must be a one-woman man. Kenneth Wost, who's a commentator, also quoted by Kaufman, says, the Greek simply says this, a man of one woman. Now there are three senses in which this is often understood. And there's other, I guess, possibilities as well, but let me just give you the three major senses in which this is understood. One is that an elder must have or have had a wife, not a single man. Remember from Ephesians chapter 5 that the marriage relationship is a parable for the relationship between Christ and the church. Remember he read that a husband love his wife, a wife respect her husband, and then he goes through this whole list of things and it says, what I'm really talking about is Christ and the church. In this way, a marriage, so that was in Ephesians chapter 5. And in Ephesians chapter 5, we realize that there's only one Christ and one bride of Christ, which is the church. So in this way, a married man's experience in marriage can contribute to the goal of keeping the church, the bride, without spot or blemish. So one idea here is that the elder must have had a wife or has a wife. Another way that this is understood is that the elder is prohibited from having more than one wife at a time. We might think that that seems weird or crazy, but remember previously in the Old Testament, there were men who had multiple wives at the same time. There were patriarchs, kings, and men listed in Hebrews 11. I think of Jacob, think of David, think of Solomon, other men. And even David was an inspired man who prophesied through his psalm, through some of his psalms, they were messianic prophecies. Yet he had multiple wives. But under the New Testament, polygamy is never condoned. Christians coming out of pagan religion often had a mess of moral baggage. Having multiple wives, for an example, is one of them. None of the men chosen for eldership could be polygamists. They had to be men with only one wife. And again, when Jesus was asked about marriage and divorce in Matthew 19, he went all the way back to the beginning, in Genesis chapter 2, and he spoke of Adam and Eve. And the model there was one man and one wife. This, however, cannot infer that a man could take part in marriage and divorce and marriage and divorce and marriage and divorce over and over so that he could only be the husband of one wife at a time. In that case, he'd not be a man above reproach, that's for sure. Nor would any of his marriages resemble the marriage of Christ and the church. So another way this is often understood is that the elder cannot be a person who has been divorced and remarried. Not only was polygamy rampant in pagan cultures, but during the New Testament time among the Jews, divorce was widespread as well. Again, going back to Matthew chapter 19 and verse 5, the Pharisees asked Jesus, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason?" Not only the question, but the way that this question is asked underscores how extensive and common divorce was at the time. So it was possible that a man could be divorced and remarried while a previous wife was still living. And according to Jesus, in the same chapter, this, with maybe only one exception, involves adultery. A good standard to follow is to always go back to Ephesians chapter 5 and ask, does a current situation depict the relationship of Christ and the church? Christ doesn't divorce the church for another. Christ has no relations with another's bride, no illegitimate children, no alimony, no divorce, no court, no partial custody, etc. And so this one qualification may be the most difficult to understand in this verse, and the rest I think is a little more straightforward. And all the qualifications may be the standard for the first qualification of being blameless or above reproach. When I get to the end of this verse, we'll pause for questions. But I want you to notice the next thing. He writes, temperate and sober-minded. That's according to the New King James Version. Some versions do not include temperate and go straight to sober-minded. That's likely because the repetition and overlap in the original terms. The King James Version reads, vigilant and sober. Kaufman quotes Kenneth Woost again here saying, the literal Greek here is one who sits long at his wine. It's an interesting way to think about that. Somebody who's not indulging in wine and getting drunk. In Ephesians, Paul wrote to the same group at Ephesus, do not be drunk with wine, but be filled with the Spirit. And this was in the context of walking in wisdom in Ephesians chapter 5. And so this describes the elder. Not filled with wine, not being drunk-minded, but being sober-minded, and being Spirit-filled and having wisdom. And so far we've noticed that the preconditions of leadership in the church are not such things as that are unusual talents, wealth, power, ability, but sound moral and ethical conduct is what's being expressed here. Therefore, temperate and sober-minded. The next thing we read is of good behavior. Other versions read self-controlled, respectable. Still others use words like sensible and prudent. The various versions supply good understanding of what's being expressed. The opposite would be someone who acts spontaneous and random ways, that does not take all the matters into account before acting. Next is hospitable. These are people who accommodate others and make them feel welcome. One commentator reasoned that when Paul wrote this, travel was widespread and safe places to stay were not. There was not a Holiday Inn that you could easily call on your way into town and make a reservation. As such, this hospitality was not, as such, there were travelers who were seeking a safe refuge, sometimes even from persecution. And so there's a note here that the elders should be people who are hospitable. This hospitality was not so much the kind that invites friends and family over to have a good time, as much as it was the kind that provides for strangers and people in need. In this way, the duty of elders not only reached in for the maintenance of the members, but also reached out to maintain a Christ-like relationship towards those on the outside. I don't want to embarrass my mother or anything, but I want to use my mom and dad as an illustration here. They are people who practice hospitality, I believe, the way that Paul intended it right here. During my years at home, there were very few even months, where there was not somebody else living in our home. There were many more than dozens of individuals and families who lived with us. Not just came to visit, but took up residence for weeks, months, and even years. Some of those people were sick people. Some of them were terminally ill. Some of them were elderly. Some of these people were broke financially. They were homeless, helpless people, and families, entire families who came who needed a safe place of refuge. Some of them were friends. Some of them were family. Some of them were church members. And some of them were even strangers that we did not know. One resident became my brother. One resident left her son, me, to be their child. And though I experienced all of this, I don't excel in hospitality like that. But I think this is a good example of what Paul is writing about here, about being hospitable. And then he says, able to teach. The King James Version says apt to teach. One of the New American Standard Bibles reads skillful in teaching, and I like that really good. Skillful in teaching conveys the intention of this qualification better than any other, I think. As we know from chapter 1, there were some people in Ephesus who desired to be teachers, but they didn't understand what they were talking about. And so I prefer able to teach, or better yet, skillful in teaching over apt to teach, because some people who want to be teachers are apt to teach just about anything. We can think of it not so much as a natural gift to talk, but the aptitude that comes from being a student of the Scriptures themselves. Kaufman writes that every elder should be able to shut the mouths of the gainsayers, that is, people who deny and dispute and contradict, and they should be able to shield the church from false teaching. And so in our modern era, there are many Bible critics and people who push amoral philosophies. Some even twist the Scriptures to justify their behavior. And the elder is charged with the burden of being able to teach in such a skillful manner that the house of God is unfazed under such assaults. And so there's a lot in verse 2 alone. A bishop must be blameless, the husband of one wife, temperate, sober-minded, of good behavior, hospitable, and able to teach. Thoughts or comments on verse 2? Lance?
When you were talking about the opposite of good behavior, you mentioned, spontaneous, impulsive maybe.
Yeah.
And I always thought that's how Peter was described. And wasn't he one of the first elders?
Yeah, he was. But I think that shows his progression. When we first meet Peter, he's spontaneous, he's impulsive, and then by the time we come to the letter that he wrote, he's this elder who is sound and solid and able. I liken him to starting out like an air hose, just all over the place, and then ending up like an anchor, or not even an anchor, maybe an archer who's steady and aimed. And so I think that's a good illustration. Peter didn't start out as an elder when he was first converted, but he became that. And so I think that's a really good thing to notice. Garfield.
You mentioned your dad earlier, and I think I'll mention that a little bit more. He was probably the most giving person that I've run into in my lifetime in an eldership. He would dig in his pocket. He would dig in his freezer. He'd get in his garden and take stuff to people. He was probably the most giving person I've ever run into.
Yeah.
Period.
Yeah, he was. Thank you for saying so.
Yeah.
Nick.
I have a couple things. One, when you think about being apt to teach, I think in our modern context, we usually think of that as, is this someone who's going to get up and teach a public class or something? But it doesn't say that. And so this shows more than just that, although that would be an application of it. It's teaching in general, not necessarily in a public way, but maybe in a private way or what have you. You think about someone who is apt or who is able to teach, we tend to think of that in a couple ways. One is maybe they're an effective communicator, but sometimes those people, if they're not well versed in the Scriptures, they might actually do more harm than good. You need someone obviously you want a good communicator, but you want someone who's more apt in the scriptures. And I tend to think that is really what Paul has in mind when he says that. And then about the marriage aspect of this, in Matthew 19, when they asked Jesus that question, that was the question of the day about divorce and so on, to the point to where your opinion of it would vary depending on what rabbi you follow. One rabbi would say, oh, it has to be for adultery. Another rabbi would say, well, if she burned your toast, thinking in our modern terms, you could put her away that way. And it stems from a verse in Deuteronomy 24, which says, when a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes, because he has found some indecency in her, then he can give the certificate of divorce. And that's what they quote when they say this to Jesus about a certificate of divorce. And then he obviously elaborates on that. But this was such a hot topic of the day, and it obviously is still a hot topic today, thinking of divorce and so on. But it just goes to show God's will is one man, one woman forever.
That's good. Good point. So it goes back to really God's will for every marriage, not just that of elders, but especially them. But then also, Nick mentioned about the idea of being apt to teach. That doesn't necessarily mean public teaching, although I think that's included. There's a lot of teaching that goes on over the kitchen table. And in modern day, over the internet, right? CJ, you do a lot of Bible studies over the internet. And so it doesn't necessarily mean somebody who has great orator skills, but they can teach. And as we mentioned a couple weeks ago, there are women who teach without saying a word. And so there's multiple ways, I suppose, for that to take place. CJ?
For the husband of one wife, what if the elder was divorced and his divorce met with the exception of Matthew 19? Would that fall under here or not?
CJ wants to chase a rabbit here for a minute. His question is about divorce. Can a man, I think if I understand, can a man serve as an elder if he's been divorced? I think there's a couple ways that this is sometimes explained on both sides. That if you read there in verse 2, a bishop then must be, that seems to be something that is present tense. So on the other hand, we sometimes assume that means a current state of being married right now. But if I understand the Greek here of be, it's and I don't completely understand all of the tense and things, but this is a present infinitive form, which I understand is a state of being without a specific tense. So it could be past, present, past or present. And so it seems that even if a man's wife has passed, he is still a one-woman man. He can still be that elder, that person who can say, yes, I've only had one wife, and still honestly be the husband of one wife. But when we're talking about a divorce and then a remarriage, that person could say, I'm the husband of one wife now. Is that okay or not? Well, that's a kind of a gray area, I think, and I know a lot of people say that they have the answer to this clear as a bell, black and white. It's just like they say they understand marriage, divorce, and remarriage just as clear as a bell, black. When somebody tells me they understand it perfectly, I'm skeptical of them. I really am. In Hebrews chapter 13, the Bible says that marriage is honorable among all, and the bed undefiled. But fornicators and adulterers, God will judge. And so I think that this may infer that marriages that are conducted without the element of adultery and fornication, which usually leads to divorce, are honorable. And so whether it is the first marriage or the one after the passage of a spouse, it kind of depends on if that marriage is honorable or not. And this is the way I see it, but I'm just one out of many people here. And so that's not a clear answer, because I had a good friend who was a preacher, and he was divorced. And his wife left him, and he lived single for a long time, and he continued to preach on and off, filling in and sometimes full time. And then he met somebody, and they were married, and he continued to preach. And then eventually they asked him to be an elder, and he accepted. He didn't ask me what I thought. Had he asked me what I thought, I would have told him, no, I don't think that you should be an elder. So there's a liberal way to look at it and a conservative way to look at it. The conservative way kind of takes all of these into account and makes sure that we don't take liberties where liberties don't exist. That's the definition of a liberal view or a liberal person. They take liberties where liberties don't exist. On the other hand, we don't want to be so conservative that we bind something that's not supposed to be bound, right? So we want to be right about it. And so I just would say that if that situation would happen, we'd have to take all this into account and be cautious about it and study about it. I don't have a clear answer for you. Yeah, Joe.
If they're already an elder and they got divorced and he's been divorced for a long time, would that be taken away from him?
Say that again?
What if he was already married and he was already an elder and they got divorced and they were divorced for a long time, and would that elder be taken away from him?
Yeah, I think it would. Again, you'd probably have to look at whether this marriage was honorable, how that it happened and all that. But that's, I don't know, I'm not going to get into every little detail because the Bible doesn't get into every little detail about it. That's a difficult one.
So to continue down the rabbit hole.
We're going to go down the rabbit hole a little bit further.
So as long as you remain divorced and not married, you still.
Perhaps, and then you would have to take into account maybe the reasons for it. Right? Yeah. That can be very complicated.
I wish we could just have a direct line to the Apostle Paul and say, okay, what do you mean by that statement?
One day you will. One day you will.
So we do know for sure what that looks like, one man and one woman. You know, we have Amos and Mary Ellen, we have Garfield and Nancy, and they're the only people that's been married to each other, you know, and so we have that standard. And I think that is clearly okay and good. Everything else we'd have to really dig in and study about that.
I think there's a lot of elders that if we happen to have lost our wife somewhere down the line, what would we do?
Yeah.
Would we continue on? Because that language can be viewed in the ways that you mentioned.
Yeah.
You know, husband of one wife, but I don't have a wife anymore, if that was the case.
I'm helping. Today.
Those are some things that an elder must think about.
Right.
Not everybody else looking on the elder, but the elder himself looking about it.
Yeah, that's something that.
And how he values the word, because that's something you should, that's the one, that's a good testament to what kind of elder is, you know, in my opinion, how he holds the word to himself.
Well said. So, yeah, Amos is making the point that it's not necessarily what everybody else thinks, but that man will have to make that decision because he has to answer, right?
And not only that, but the eldership itself, if it's a situation where, say, you have 5 elders and one becomes a widower, he may want to step down, but if the other elders say, no, we want to stay on, you know, that's a discussion too.
Right.
I want to mention one thing that an elder does need, and he needs a wife. There's times where you have to have the opinion of your wife if you want sometimes, say there's marriage problems between a couple. You're going to get from the man's side, his side of the story, you're going to get her side of the story. But having a wife here that I can convey to and talk to, because usually Asma says, can I tell my wife about this? And her opinion means a lot to me when you try to come to some kind of decision on what come up. So I can see the reason why he says a man's got to have a wife to hold this position.
every man that is married, would you say that you're a different man after marriage than you were before marriage in some ways? Yeah. I mean, we don't even squeeze the toothpaste the same way, do we? Yeah, so that it does change our life perspective for sure. Well, let's continue here on verse 3. My version reads, "Not given to wine, not violent, not greedy for money, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not covetous." So, not given to wine. Other versions read, "Not given to drunkenness, not a drunkard, not overindulgent in wine, not excessive drinker." So this is in concert with the previous qualification of being sober-minded. We easily understand how a drunk shepherd would be harmful, right? So in the next lines, various versions put this list in different orders and use different words, but they all convey the same meaning. So I was reading through here, I noticed that my version is probably going to read close even to some of yours. So the New King James Version reads, for the rest of this verse, "Not violent, not greedy for money, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not covetous." The Old King James Version reads, "Not a striker, not greedy for filthy lucre." I like that phrase, filthy lucre. "But patient, not a brawler, not covetous." The NIV and the ESV read the same, I think. "Not violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money." And the new the NASB 20, there's a couple different NASBs. "Not a bully, but gentle, not covetous, and free from the love of money." Each of these, I think, convey the same idea, but they use different words and they place these qualifications in different places. These men cannot be people who walk around with a chip on their shoulder. Not the kind of person who says, "Let's take it outside." Not the kind of person who likes to rattle the cages or stir up frustration. And when it comes to getting their way, as long as it does nobody harm but themselves and it doesn't violate the Scripture, they're not contentious. Instead, they're considerate. And when it comes to money, whether it is their interest, whatever it is, their interests are much deeper than the financial benefits, be it personal accounts or the church accounts. They remember the mission of Jesus, that he didn't come to make rich, but he came to seek and to save the lost. The Bible indicates that some shepherds receive remuneration for their services. You can look at 1 Timothy 5:17, 1 Corinthians 9:7 and following if you want to study that. But the one who does take remuneration should only receive it so that they can serve the mission, not because they're greedy. And so verse 3 is pretty short: "Not given to wine, not violent, not greedy for money, but gentle, not quarrelsome, and covetous." And a lot of those are overlaps. Any thoughts on verse 3? Nick?
I think about someone being quarrelsome or contentious, and I just think of someone who's in a leadership position, whether it be as an elder or otherwise, in business or what have you. If you run into someone and they're contentious, if they're constantly picking fights, and it's almost always on things that don't even matter, to me that is a really poor reflection. And so a lot of these things kind of tie in with the idea of being above reproach or blameless. These are things that if you're blameless, you're not going to do these things.
Yeah, you're right. And sometimes it's that contentious person, the insolent person who's insulting people and so on, that gets the attention and people become afraid of them, like the NASB, a bully. But that's not the way the elder leads. They lead like a shepherd.
Well, I was in first place I preached in West Virginia. There was a lot of coal miners who were union coal miners. And so where it says that the King James not a striker, there's one where we always brought that up and said, "Chris, if you're a coal miner, you're not allowed to strike."
Yes.
That was his take, and I'm serious in heart that. He always brought that up, and I can kind of laugh about it today. I don't think he's no longer with us, but he actually believed that.
Okay. Yeah, I think the other versions make it pretty clear. He's talking about can't be a person who is violent. It'd be yeah. All right. Let's go on. Verse 4. "One who rules his own house well, having his children in submission with all reverence. Verse 5, for if a man does not know how to rule his own house, how will he take care of the church of God? Unfortunately, in this passage, I think there's some who stress the point of this verse to be that an elder must have children. Well, that's true. But overstressing of having children has, I think, in some cases, reduced the process of selecting an elder to anybody who has children. And this misses the point. This qualification isn't about one's ability to fill their house with children, but how well they manage their household. And every home is different. There's different numbers of children, there's different temperaments and different ages, different financial statuses from house to house, different abilities and disabilities that are within one house. There's different hurts and scars and offenses within each house. There's different resources, different shifts that people work in each house, different setbacks, different successes, and different tragedies in each house. And all of these differences and more are found within the local congregation. As a marriage is associated with Christ and the church, here the association extends to the family, at least to the point that the management of the family home is reflective of the management of God's family, the church, which is the house of God. Because it says, for if a man does not know how to rule his house, how will he care for the church of God? Any thoughts on verse 4 and 5? Yeah, Joe?
Days, because there's different for ages and generations. Like, we came from generations where if you see you crying, I'm going to give you something to cry about, or you drink from a hose and that, and then there's this technology and that we have too compared to then and now to deal with. Parenting is kind of different to take care of.
Yeah, different generations have each their own way of, their own kind of world that they grow up in, right? Garfield?
In the book of Titus, the first chapter, when it's talking about children, it's talking about elders have believing children.
Yep, this isn't the, also Titus, he writes to Titus and has much of the same qualifications. Some's a little bit different.
It goes to show, you think of what you would want in an elder, and, you could have the kindest person you could possibly think of, but being kind is one thing, but being a leader is something totally different. What you need in an elder is someone who is both of those things, someone who is above reproach and so on, but also someone who can lead his household well and can lead the church well. Because sometimes you might have someone who could be a good leader, but if they're going to be a drill sergeant, then that's not appropriate. And if you have someone who's really kind and above reproach, but then they can't lead anything, then you're left between a rock and a hard place either way.
Yeah. True. Lance?
I'm not a father, but I am a son. And the second half of this verse, children obey him with proper respect. I'm just wondering, me and my dad, we kind of poke and prod each other. I'm just wondering where that line really is drawn.
Yeah, I don't know for sure. My version says in submission with all reverence. So I think, that might be something that would be left up to how do you feel about this? Do you know you're joking? Are you having fun with each other? Or is this disrespect? I think that might be the difference. Yeah.
I think part of it's missing, people talk about bullying or being strong-headed or whatever, but, there's times where elders, they have to be firm as well in their stance that they're dealing with members of the church, and it's, maybe sometimes it's taken in a different manner, but there becomes a point where, right is right, wrong is wrong. You have the ability to change, if you're the one that's having this issue or whatever. So I think that's kind of a fine line too. You can't be a milquetoast. You need to be firm in that and dealings with that. Otherwise, things start to creep in to congregations that shouldn't be allowed to creep in.
Yeah, so Daryl's talking about, there's a difference, I guess, between stubbornness and bullheadedness and being firm. And you see that played out in parents a lot, dads. Some, they seem to be the sergeant, and there's not a lot of love that goes into their parenting. And some are, like you said, milquetoast. And so you look at this, and I think that's what Paul's saying is, if a man does not know how to rule his own house, how will he take care of the church of God? Carl?
Things in being a person where you make decisions is to say no. It's our nature to say go ahead. But the hardest thing is the same as raising your children. Hardest thing is to say, talking to your children, you have to say no. And in a church family, sometimes you have to say no.
Sometimes no has to be said, just like it does at home, right? Okay, verse 6 begins in the New King James Version, not a novice. Other versions read, not a convert, a new convert, not a new convert, or a recent believer. Vine's Expository Dictionary of the New Testament Words explains that this means someone who is newly planted and who is inexperienced, is unfit for the position of an overseer. And there are some, perhaps, who have obeyed the gospel many years previous, but remain a novice in the sense that they've been planted, but maturity hasn't come very quickly. It's come slowly. And so it seems obvious why we'd want an elder who's not a novice. They have to defend the faith. They have to manage the house of God. They have to have experiences that have led them to Christ-like maturity. They have to know the flock, etc. But the reason that Paul gives next is somewhat surprising. Not a novice, lest, being puffed up with pride, he fall into the same condemnation as the devil. We've seen that throughout history when mankind elevated themselves to the point of dictating how they would serve God or to be served like a god, it always led to the downfall. It seems that pride was the element that led to the fall of the devil and his angels. In Jude 6, we read, the angels who did not keep their proper domain but left their own abode, he has reserved in everlasting chains under darkness for judgment of the great day. Apparently they wanted independence. Apparently. And in their arrogance they lifted themselves up from their proper place for which they were created, and they will suffer judgment. And how easy it would be for a new convert or an immature believer to become puffed up if tasked with the position of an overseer when they are not ready. Verse 6. Any other thoughts on verse 6? We'll finish in verse 7 in just a minute. So they need to be somebody who's mature in various ways, especially in the Scriptures. Verse 7, moreover, he must have a good testimony among those who are outside, lest he fall into reproach and the snare of the devil. According to the Blue Letter Bible, the word snare is linked to trap, noose, or whatever brings peril, loss, or destruction. And so remember in verse 1, they are to be blameless and without reproach. It would be a snare for the whole church that would be set by the devil. For someone with a position like this to bring reproach, to bring moral disappointment upon the church because of a scandal of which they were embroiled in. So it's important that the elder have a good reputation among those who are outside as well. All right, that's through verse 7. Any other thoughts?
One of the benefits, I think, of having someone who's not a novice, they tend to be older in terms of their age, and it's kind of implied in the term elder. And one of the benefits of that, and it's not really listed, but I think it is a benefit, you tend to have someone who's got life experiences as well, and that way, and I think Garfield and Nancy are great examples of this. Anytime someone comes and they're dealing with a situation, oftentimes maybe an elder has dealt with similar situations, whether it be something like a tragedy or a hardship in some way. If you have someone with that life experience, they can share that experience with you, and it could be a lot easier that way than having to figure it out on your own.
Yeah, that's true. And I can tell you from experience how true that is. There's been times when I have had things that I had to deal with, and I talked to the elders about it. And they've had similar situations, you know, and it's been helpful to be able to approach people who've been there. But not only do they have experiences, a lot of people have experiences, but they have a Bible base that to bring to those experiences in counsel.
As we read through those and looked at those again tonight, it's just a great deal of wisdom. There's a lot of wisdom in what Paul wrote there. And I don't know that I used to think of it in those terms, but, you know, the Bible has so much to offer us about wisdom and how to have knowledge that's practical and useful. It's just, you know, if you're looking for a person to serve in this capacity, did the Lord do what he was doing in terms of a job description of qualifications, how we want to look at it, qualities of a godly leader. A lot of wisdom there.
A lot of wisdom, it's true. Wisdom, knowledge, love, all those things wrapped up.
A lot of these are, you know, verses in Proverbs that are related to the passages that we're talking about here today, about just men of God and how they should be, how they should act, and how they should interact.
The Book of Wisdom describes a lot of these things here. And none of these characteristics are things that anybody should be ashamed of. We should all be striving for these. I think it would make shepherds happy if everybody else in the congregation had these qualities. It would make the shepherding easy, in fact. This last one here talks about having a good reputation or a good testimony among those who are on the outside. More and more that seems difficult because there's so many frustrations on the outside, and it's hard to remain calm and wise. But I was give you one story. One of our elders was Gene Lamb. He was an elder here for many, many years, and he was an electrician at Buick. And a long time ago, I was an electrician also, and I went to a seminar for a code class, and there were some men there who were a generation or more older than I, and we were in line for lunch together, and I heard these two guys talking, and evidently they had worked at Buick many years ago together. And they started talking about people that they worked with, and I didn't say a word. I just listened, and they said, Gene Lamb, you remember Gene Lamb? And the other guy said, oh yeah, I remember Gene. He was a good man. He was a great man. And I wanted to say, I know Gene too, but I just listened. And they said, yeah, he never said a bad word about anybody. And he said, you know, you're right. You know, we worked together during the Nixon administration, and he never even said a bad word about Nixon. And so I couldn't wait to tell Gene that. But I think that just exemplifies what Paul's talking about here, that the people on the outside will give you a good testimony as well. All right, thanks for your attention. I appreciate you and your participation tonight. Nick will share some announcements, and then we'll be dismissed.